Did you know that in late November 1941, a German motorcycle reconnaissance unit reportedly reached a vantage point so close to the Soviet capital that they could see the sun glinting off the golden domes of the Kremlin through their high-powered binoculars? It is one of the most enduring images of the Second World War. The invader at the gate, the barbarians staring at the heart of the empire. But like so many stories from the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, the reality is far more complex, far more terrifying, and far less romantic than a simple visual confirmation of a target. They were not just close enough to see it. They were close enough to change the trajectory of the 20th century, only to be stopped by a friction so immense it shattered the myth of invincibility forever. My name is Jack, and this is my audiobook narrative about the Battle of Moscow. We are not just going to measure the kilometers on a map. We are going to look at the fuel gauges of Panzer IV tanks sitting dead on the Volokholamsk highway. We are going to count the calories in the belly of a Wehrmacht infantryman shivering in a summer tunic while the temperature drops to 30 below zero. We are going to witness the panic of a city that believed it had already fallen, and the cold mathematical brutality of the counterstroke that saved it. This is the story of the high water mark of the Third Reich, December 2nd, 1941, the village of Khimki, just 8 kilometers from the city limits of Moscow. 8 kilometers. That is a morning jog. That is a 15-minute drive in light traffic. For the lead elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, it might as well have been the distance to the moon. The temperature was minus 35 degrees Celsius. The metal of the rifles burned the skin if touched without gloves. Bread had to be cut with axes because it was frozen solid. The German army, the Wehrmacht, which had conquered Poland in a month, France in 6 weeks, and the Balkans in mere days, was now grinding to a halt, not because of a lack of will, but because the physics of warfare had turned against them. But to understand how they got to that bus stop in Khimki and why they could go no further, we have to rewind. We have to look at the machine when it was still running hot. October 2nd, 1941. Operation Typhoon begins. The plan was simple. It was classic Prussian militarism adapted for the internal combustion engine. A double pincer movement. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, would shatter the Soviet defenses in front of Moscow, encircle the Red Army forces at Vyazma and Bryansk, and then drive on to the capital before the winter set in. The numbers were staggering. On paper, it looked like a massacre waiting to happen. The Germans amassed nearly 2 million men, 1,000 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces, over 1,000 aircraft. It was the largest concentration of military force the world had ever seen on a single axis of advance. Against them stood the Soviet Western Reserve and Bryansk fronts. On paper, the Soviets had numbers too, 1.25 million men. But these numbers were deceptive. Many were militia, poorly trained, poorly armed, terrified. In the first days of October, the German machine worked exactly as advertised. It was a symphony of violence. The panzers punched through the Soviet lines like a sledgehammer through rotten wood. General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group II raced north. General Hermann Hoth's Panzer Group III raced south. They were closing the jaws. By October 7th, the trap snapped shut at Vyazma. 4 Soviet armies were encircled. At Bryansk, another 3 armies were cut off. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions for the Soviet Union. In just 2 weeks, the Germans captured over 650,000 Soviet prisoners. Let that number sink in. 650,000 men. That is more than the entire active duty strength of many modern armies today. Gone, erased from the board. The road to Moscow seemed wide open. Hitler in Berlin declared the war in the East effectively won. The newspapers printed headlines of victory. The grand strategy seemed vindicated. Kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. That was the phrase, that was the belief. But while the generals in Berlin were popping champagne, the soldiers on the ground were noticing something else, something disturbing: the dust. For months, the German columns had marched under clouds of choking summer dust. It coated their lungs, their engines, their uniforms. But in early October, the dust stopped. The skies turned gray. And then the rain began. It wasn't a storm. It was a season. The Rasputitsa, the time without roads. Russian soil is unique. It has a high clay content. When it gets wet, it doesn't just get muddy. It transforms. It becomes a viscous, suctioning substance that defies logic. It pulls boots off feet. It swallows wheels up to
the axle. It grabs tank tracks and refuses to let go. By October 8th, the advance of Army Group Center had slowed from a sprint to a crawl. Vehicles that could travel 50 kilometers a day were now lucky to make 5. Supply trucks, the lifelines of the mechanized army, were stranded miles behind the front. Horses, the backbone of the German logistics system. And never forget, despite the newsreels of tanks, the Wehrmacht was 80% horse-drawn, began to die of exhaustion. They were pulling wagons through mud that reached their chests. The math of logistics began to collapse. A panzer division needs 300 tons of supplies a day to function: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food. In the mud, the delivery dropped to less than 30 tons. And yet they pushed on. The momentum of victory is a powerful drug. The commanders, staring at their maps, measured the distance to Moscow. 100 kilometers, 80 kilometers. It was right there, just one more push. Inside the Kremlin, the mood was apocalyptic. Stalin, who had refused to believe the invasion was imminent in June, was now facing the reality of annihilation. On October 15th, he ordered the evacuation of the government. The diplomats left. The factories were packed onto trains and shipped east to the Urals. The treasures of the Hermitage were crated up. On October 16th, a strange thing happened in Moscow. The metro stopped running. The Moscow metro was the pride of the Soviet state. It was a symbol of order, of progress, of the triumph of socialism. When the trains didn't run, the people knew. The end was near. Panic seized the city. For 3 days, there was chaos. People looted shops. Officials burned documents in the courtyards of government buildings, the ash falling like black snow over the streets. Cars jammed the roads leading east, laden with mattresses and suitcases. There were reports of party members tearing up their membership cards and flushing them down toilets. Moscow was teetering on the edge of collapse. The door was kicked in, the structure was shaking, but the Germans couldn't walk through it. They were stuck in the mud. At the headquarters of Army Group Center, Field Marshal von Bock was a man possessed. He was a classic Prussian officer, gaunt, arrogant, driven by a sense of duty that bordered on the pathological. He knew the window was closing. He knew winter was coming, but he also knew that if they stopped now, the war was lost. A war of attrition against the Soviet Union was a war Germany could not win. They had to win it now. So he ordered the attack to continue, despite the mud, despite the exhaustion, despite the fact that his tanks were running on fumes. On the other side of the line, a new player entered the game, Georgy Zhukov. Stalin had recalled him from Leningrad, where he had stabilized the front and given him command of the defense of Moscow. Zhukov was not a nice man. He was brutal, he was coarse, he was ruthless, but he was exactly what
the situation required. He looked at the map and he saw what the Germans refused to see. Their supply lines were overextended. Their flanks were exposed. Their men were exhausted. He organized the defense with what he had. He scraped together the remnants of the shattered armies. He mobilized the civilians. 250,000 Muscovites, mostly women and teenagers, were sent out to dig anti-tank ditches. They moved 3 million cubic meters of earth with shovels and pickaxes. They built concentric rings of defense around the city. Zhukov's strategy was simple: trade space for time, bleed the Germans for every meter, make them pay in fuel, in ammunition, in blood, and wait for the mud to freeze. In early November, the temperature dropped. The ground hardened. The Rasputitsa was over. The roads were passable again. The German commanders breathed a sigh of relief. The engines roared to life. The tracks gripped the frozen earth. Operation Typhoon could resume, but the cold that hardened the ground brought a new enemy: General Winter. The German army was not equipped for winter warfare. This is one of the great failures of planning in military history. The High Command had assumed the war would be over by September. They had not ordered winter uniforms. There was no antifreeze for the vehicles. There were no white camouflage suits. As the mercury plummeted, the problems cascaded. Guns jammed because the oil froze. To fire a rifle, a soldier had to scrape the oil off the bolt. Batteries in the radios died. Engines wouldn't start unless fires were lit underneath them to warm the oil sumps and the men. A German soldier in 1941 was wearing a cotton tunic, denim trousers, and hobnailed jackboots. The hobnails conducted the cold straight from the ground into the feet. Frostbite became an epidemic. Thousands of men were losing toes, fingers, ears. Yet they advanced. By mid-November, the final phase of the offensive began, the flight to the front. It was a desperate gamble. The pincers pushed out again. The 3rd and 4th Panzer groups to the north of Moscow. The 2nd Panzer Group to the south. They clawed their way forward. They took Klin. They took Solnekhnogorsk. They crossed the Moscow-Volga Canal. On November 27th, the 7th, Panzer Division, the Ghost Division, once commanded by Rommel, reached the bridge over the canal at Yakroma. They were less than 30 kilometers from the Kremlin. They established a bridgehead. They looked east, but they were a shell of their former selves. A Panzer Division that started with 200 tanks might now have 20 operational. The companies were commanded by lieutenants because the captains were dead. The battalions were commanded by captains because the majors were dead. The resistance they faced was stiffening. The closer they got to Moscow, the harder the Soviets fought. It wasn't just militia anymore. New units were appearing on the line. Men in white sheepskin coats. Men with felt, boots that kept their feet warm. Men with submachine guns that worked in the cold. Siberians. Stalin had made a gamble of his own. His spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, had sent word that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in the east. Japan was looking south towards the Americans and the British. Stalin stripped the far eastern borders. He put the veteran Siberian divisions on trains. They rolled west thousands of kilometers across the taiga, straight into the cauldron of Moscow. These were tough men, hardened by the harsh climate of the east, well-equipped, well-fed, and they were angry. The collision was approaching. The exhausted, freezing, but still lethal Wehrmacht against the desperate, reinforced Red Army. Let's focus on one specific unit to understand the micro scale of this horror. The infantry regiment, Grossdeutschland, an elite unit. They were pushing towards Tula, south of Moscow. Their diary entries from this time are a descent into madness. November 18th. Cold is
intense. Machine guns frozen. We attack across open fields. The Russians are dug in. We take the village, but lose 50 men. We cannot dig foxholes because the ground is like iron. We sleep in the snow. November 24th. No food for 2 days. The supply trucks are stuck in snowdrifts. We are eating the horses that die. We burn the peasant huts to stay warm, then march on. November 29th. We can see the chimneys of Tula. We are so close, but we cannot break through. The Russian tanks, the T-34s, are immune to our anti-tank guns. They roll over our positions. We throw grenades under their tracks. It is suicide. This was the reality of the vicinity of Moscow. It wasn't a clean line on a map. It was a series of desperate small unit actions fought in blinding snowstorms, in villages that had been burned to the ground, over bridges that were rigged with explosives. And then came the bus stop. The legend of the reconnaissance battalion of the 258th Infantry Division. Or was it the 2nd
Panzer? Accounts vary. The fog of war is thick, but the story goes that a motorcycle patrol penetrated the lines at Khimki. They drove down the empty road. The silence was eerie. They stopped. They looked at the sign. Moscow, 8 kilometers. They could see the barrage balloons hanging over the city. They could hear the distant wail of sirens. Some say they saw the Kremlin towers. Geographically, it's unlikely from ground level due to the terrain and buildings, but perhaps they saw the spires of a cathedral they mistook for the Kremlin, or perhaps in the delirium of exhaustion, they saw what they wanted to see, the prize. They didn't stay long. Soviet patrols engaged them. They turned their motorcycles around and sped back into the white void. That was it. That was the high water mark, the furthest ripple of the tide. Because on December 5th, 1941, everything changed. The temperature was minus 38. The German offensive had stalled along the entire front. They were literally frozen in place. The commanders were asking for permission to retreat to shorter defensible lines. Hitler refused. Not one step back, he ordered. He believed that if they retreated, the army would disintegrate like Napoleon's did in 1812. At that exact moment of maximum fragility, Zhukov unleashed his counteroffensive. He had hoarded his reserves. He had ignored the pleas of his subordinates to release them earlier to plug gaps. He had waited until the German spring was stretched to its absolute limit. And then he let it go. 100 divisions, new tanks, new aircraft, ski battalions, cavalry corps. They slammed into the frozen German flanks. The Germans were stunned. Their intelligence had said the Red Army was finished. that they had no reserves left. The Russian is dead, the intelligence chief had said. He just doesn't know it yet. They were wrong. The dead man was punching back. The first blow fell on the northern pincer, then the southern, then the center. For the Germans, soldier, it was a nightmare. The engines wouldn't start. The bolts wouldn't cycle. The heavy weapons were immovable in the deep snow. Panic began to set in. The disciplined withdrawal turned into a rout in some sectors. Equipment was abandoned. Guns were spiked. Men threw away their rifles to run faster through the snow. General Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, wrote to his wife, "The cold, the hunger, and the lack of supplies are destroying us. We are suffering a defeat." The myth of the invincibility of the Wehrmacht was buried in the snowdrifts outside Moscow. They had conquered Europe, but they could not conquer the last 8 kilometers. This brings us to the end of the setup. We have zoomed out to the map, and we have zoomed into the frozen soldier. We have seen the machine break. But to truly understand the texture of this failure, we need to go deeper into the development. We need to look at the specific systems that failed. The trains, the winter clothing, the
medical corps. And we need to look at the human cost on the other side. The civilians trapped in the middle. To understand why the German army died on the doorstep of Moscow, you cannot look at the map of the front line. You have to look 500 kilometers behind it. You have to look at the railway tracks. Logistics is the boring science that dictates who lives and who dies. In 1941, the German logistics system was a suicide pact. The problem was geometry. European railway tracks. The veins of the German supply body are 1,435 millimeters wide. This is the standard gauge. German trains, German locomotives, and German rolling stock are built for this width. The Soviet Union, however, used a gauge of 1,524 millimeters, 89 millimeters wider. It sounds like a trivial difference, about the length of a finger. But in the world of steel wheels and iron rails, that finger was an ocean. When the Wehrmacht advanced, they
captured thousands of kilometers of Soviet track. But their trains couldn't run on them. The wheels would fall between the rails. They had to offload every single crate of ammunition, every barrel of fuel, and every loaf of bread at the border, transfer it onto trucks or captured Soviet wagons, and then move it forward. Or they had to physically move the rails. Imagine this task. It is November. The ground is frozen solid. You are a railway pioneer. You have to pull up heavy steel spikes from concrete hard sleepers, move the heavy iron rail 89 millimeters inward, and hammer it back down. You have to do this for 2,000 kilometers. While partisans are blowing up the tracks behind you, while the snow is burying your work faster than you can finish it. By mid-November, the railhead was hundreds of kilometers behind the spearhead. The army was tethered to a lifeline that was snapping. This forced the Germans to rely on trucks, the Opel Blitz. A good truck, reliable, on a
paved German autobahn. In Russia, there were no autobahns, there were dirt tracks. When the Rasputitsa mud turned to ice, these tracks became rutted nightmares of frozen earth, hard as granite and jagged as broken glass. The trucks broke, axles snapped, transmissions shattered, tires shredded. By December, the German army had lost 40% of its entire motor transport fleet, not to enemy fire, to the road itself. This is where the grand mechanized army of the 20th century devolved into something medieval. To keep moving, the Wehrmacht stole. They confiscated thousands of pange wagons. These were small wooden peasant carts drawn by sturdy Russian ponies. These ponies were the unsung heroes of the Eastern Front. They could eat thatch from a roof and survive. They could walk through snow that would stall a panzer. So you had the absurd image of the most technologically advanced army in the world. The army of the radio and the dive bomber relying on stolen peasant ponies to bring artillery shells to the front. It was a regression of centuries. And what were they bringing? They were bringing ammunition. They were bringing fuel, but they were not bringing winter clothes. The priority system of the Wehrmacht logistics was ruthless. Fuel came first, ammo came second, food came third, clothing was a distant fourth. The logic was, we will be in Moscow before the snow falls. We will quarter in warm Russian barracks. That gamble failed, and the bill came due in human flesh. Let us zoom in on the physical reality of a German sentry on the night of December 4th. He is wearing a standard issue tunic. Underneath, he has every piece of clothing he owns. Stolen sweaters, a woman's scarf, newspapers stuffed into his trousers for insulation. He is wearing jackboots, leather boots with steel hobnails on the soles. Steel is a conductor. It pulls the heat out of the foot and pumps the cold in. The foot goes numb, then it hurts, then it stops hurting. That is the danger
zone. When the pain stops, the tissue is dying. If he takes the boot off, he might not get it back on because his foot will swell instantly. If he leaves it on, the gangrene sets in. The surgeons in the field hospitals were performing amputations without anesthetic because the ether had frozen in the bottles. They used saws meant for carpentry. The piles of limbs outside the medical tents grew so high they were used as windbreaks. The cold did things that defied belief. Optical sights on sniper rifles cracked from the thermal stress. The recoil fluid in artillery pieces froze into a jelly. If you fired the gun, the barrel wouldn't recoil. The carriage would shatter or the gun would explode. Bread arrived at the front lines as blocks of stone. Soldiers had to use axes to chop off a piece. Then they had to put the shard of frozen bread in their armpit for an hour to thaw it enough to chew. If they ate it frozen, it would burn the lining of their stomach and cause internal bleeding. And
then there was the lice. When you cannot wash for 3 months, when you sleep huddled together like sheep for warmth, lice are inevitable. They lived in the seams of the uniforms. They drank the blood of the starving men. They carried typhus. Soldiers would take off their shirts and hold them over a fire to hear the lice pop. It was a nightly ritual, the crackle of the front. But the suffering was not one-sided. As the Germans froze, they turned on the land. The policy was scorched earth, but in reverse. As they retreated or hunkered down, they burned everything they couldn't use. They kicked Russian families out of their izbas, the traditional wooden log cabins. The soldiers took the house. The family, women, children, the elderly, was thrown out into the snow. Imagine a mother with 3 children standing in the white void, watching her home become a bunker for the invaders. If they were lucky, they were allowed to sleep in the stable with the animals. If they were unlucky, they walked into the forest and froze.
Thousands of Russian civilians died this way in the winter of 1941. They are the invisible casualties. They do not appear in the combat logs. They are just shadows in the snow. The German soldier shivering in that stolen cabin was also psychologically breaking. They had been told the Slavic people were Untermenschen, subhumans, inferior, that the Soviet state was a house of cards, but the subhumans were fighting with a ferocity that terrified them. And the inferior equipment was working better than their own. Let's talk about the T-34 tank. In 1941, this was a weapon from the future. It had sloped armor that deflected German shells. It had wide tracks that let it float over the snow where German panzers sank. It had a diesel engine that didn't freeze as easily as the German gasoline engines. German anti-tank crews watched in horror as their 37mm shells, which they nicknamed the door knocker, because all it did was politely knock. On the door, bounced off the T-34's hide. The only way to stop one was to get close, suicidally close. You had to climb onto the engine deck and shove a grenade into the hatch, or use a bundle of grenades under the tracks. For the German infantrymen, the sight of a white-painted T-34 emerging from a blizzard was the stuff of nightmares. It was a monster that could not be killed. This psychological shift cannot be overstated. From June to September, the Germans felt like gods. They were the masters of war. By December, they felt like victims. They were small men fighting a giant land and a giant enemy. The diaries change. In the summer, they wrote, "We are advancing 20 kilometers a day. The food is good. The war will be over soon." In December, they wrote, "God has abandoned us. The snow never stops. The Russians are everywhere. I just want to go home." But there was no going home. Behind the lines, the partisan war was igniting. The Soviet government had issued a call: set the earth on fire under the feet of the invader. Stay behind units, escape POWs, and angry civilians formed partisan bands. They lived in the deep forests. They skied out at night. They planted mines on the railway tracks, those same tracks the Germans were struggling to fix. They cut telephone wires. They ambushed supply trucks. A German truck driver, already fighting the ice and the engine trouble, now had to drive with a rifle across his lap. Every clump of trees could hide a sniper. Every bridge could be rigged. The fear was constant. There was no rear area. The front was everywhere. This environment of total insecurity, total cold, and total scarcity created a brutality spiral. The Germans responded to partisan attacks with reprisals. If a truck was ambushed near a village, the village was burned and the men were hanged. The bodies were left hanging, frozen stiff as warnings. This only made the partisans fight harder. It made the civilians help the partisans more. It was a feedback loop of violence that consumed everything. And in the middle of this chaos, the battle for Moscow shifted phases. We talked about the counteroffensive starting on December 5th. Now let's look at the mechanics of that blow. Zhukov didn't just throw men at the wall. He used combined arms in a way the Germans didn't think the Soviets were capable of. He used the ski troops. These were battalions recruited from sports clubs and Siberian hunters. They wore white camouflage. They moved silently. They didn't need roads. While the German heavy units were stuck on the roads, the Soviet ski troops would glide through the forests and appear in the German rear. They would attack the headquarters, the artillery parks, the field kitchens. They created panic. A German unit would think it was safe, 10 kilometers behind the line, and suddenly they were under mortar fire from the woods. The German command structure began to fracture. Field Marshal von Bock was sick. He had stomach cramps. He was physically collapsing from stress. Guderian, the tank genius, was ignoring orders from Hitler. Hitler said, "Hold fast." Guderian saw his division dissolving and ordered retreats to save his men. He was fired for it. Hoepner, commanding the 4th Panzer Group, was stripped of his rank and dishonorably discharged for retreating. Hitler fired the commander-in-chief of the army, von Brauchitsch. He took personal command of the army himself. This was the moment that professional German military leadership was decapitated. From this point on, the war was run by an amateur in a bunker in East Prussia who refused to look at reality. But before the generals were fired, they had to manage the catastrophe of December. The retreat from Moscow was not a clean maneuver. It was a desperate scramble. Vehicles were abandoned by the thousands, not because they were destroyed, but because they were out of fuel or stuck. The crews would drain the oil, throw a grenade in the engine block, and start walking west. The roads leading away from Moscow became museums of defeat. Miles of black skeletons of tanks, trucks, and wagons, and the bodies. As the Germans retreated, they couldn't bury their dead. The ground was too hard. They left them. The Soviets, advancing, saw the cost of the invasion. They saw the frozen corpses of the master race stacked like cordwood. They saw the German soldiers stripping the boots off dead Russians. It stripped away the mystique. The Germans weren't supermen. They were just men, and they were dying. This brings us to the midpoint of our story. The tide has turned. The Blitzkrieg is dead. The war of movement has become a war of attrition. But the story of the retreat is not just about moving backward. It is about the hedgehogs. Hitler's order to stand fast was military madness, but psychologically, it might have saved the army from total annihilation. He ordered the troops to form hedgehogs, fortified strong points in villages and towns. They were to hold these islands of resistance, even if they were surrounded, and let the Soviets flow past them. This decision created a gruesome patchwork of battles that lasted all winter. The map of the Eastern Front in January 1942 did not look like a military line. It looked like a splatter of ink. Hitler's order to create hedgehogs, or Egelstellungen, transformed the nature of the war. The continuous front, a line of soldiers linking hands from the Baltic to the Black Sea, was gone. In its place were islands of desperate resistance surrounded by a sea of Red Army dominance. Imagine a small Russian village, maybe 40 wooden houses, a church, and a school. Now pack 2,000 German soldiers into it. They barricade the windows with sandbags frozen hard as rock. They pour water on the snowbanks to create ice walls that are bulletproof. They dig their tanks into the ground until only the turrets are visible, turning panzers into pill boxes, and then they wait. Outside, the blizzard howls, and in the white darkness, the Soviets are moving past them. This was the hedgehog strategy. The idea was to force the Soviets to stop and lay siege to these towns to clear their supply lines. If the Germans held the road junctions, the Soviet advance would starve. It was a gamble that relied on one thing, the Luftwaffe. If the roads were cut, the only way to keep these men alive was from the air.
This was the birth of the air bridge myth that would later doom the Germans at Stalingrad. But in the winter of 1941, it barely worked. Let's look at the pocket at Kulm. Roughly 5,000 Germans were surrounded. Their area was smaller than a city park. They had no winter clothing. They had no heavy artillery ammunition. Junkers, Ju-52 transport planes, tried to land on a makeshift airstrip under direct Soviet mortar fire. Pilots described the approach as flying into a washing machine of flak. Many planes were shot down. Others crashed on the ice. Inside, the
pocket life became primitive. The diary of a soldier in Kulm reads, "We are eating the horse feed. It is boiled oats with straw. The bread ration is 50 grams a day. We hunt for rats." But the most harrowing detail wasn't the hunger. It was the corpse walls. The ground was too frozen to dig trenches. The Soviet fire was constant. So the defenders used what they had. They took the bodies of their fallen comrades and the bodies of the Soviet attackers, and they stacked them. They poured water over them to freeze them together. German sentries stood guard behind walls made of human bodies. This was the absolute zero of morality, the point where civilization vanishes and only survival remains. And yet the Hedgehogs held. Why? Because the Soviet steamroller was losing pressure. Stalin, seeing the Germans reel, made the same mistake Hitler had made in October. He got greedy. He looked at the map and saw a chance to win the entire war in one season. Zhukov advised him to concentrate his forces. "Strike one heavy blow," he said. "Break the center." Stalin disagreed. He ordered a general offensive along the entire front. "Attack everywhere," he commanded. This diluted the Red Army's strength. Instead of a sledgehammer, they became 1,000 needles. They pricked the Germans everywhere, but they couldn't deliver the knockout punch. The Soviet supply lines, stretching forward over the same snowy wasteland the Germans had just retreated across, began to snap. The T-34s ran out of diesel. The artillery ran out of shells. The men charging into machine gun fire in deep snow died by the tens of thousands. The momentum shifted from kinetic movement to a grinding, static slaughter. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Rzhev salient. If you look at a map of the front in early 1942, Rzhev is a bulge that points like a dagger at Moscow. It is only 150 kilometers away. The Germans held it. They knew that as long as they held Rzhev, they could threaten
Moscow again in the spring. The Soviets knew it too. They threw army after army into the Rzhev meat grinder. It was here that a new German commander rose to prominence, Walter Model. They called him the Führer's fireman. He was a short, monocled general who carried a pistol and led from the front. When he took command of the 9th Army at Rzhev, he was told the situation was hopeless. He had no reserves. His flanks were open. He asked for reinforcements. Berlin said no. So Model improvised. He scraped together cooks, clerks, and mechanics. He formed alarm battalions. He ruthlessly counterattacked. When a Soviet division broke through his lines, he didn't retreat. He cut off their supply, closed the gap behind them, and then hunted them down in the forest. The fighting at Rzhev was characterized by a density of violence that is hard to comprehend. In some sectors, the shell craters overlapped like scales on a fish. The forests were reduced to splintered stumps. Let's look at the numbers. In the first 3 months of 1942, the Red Army lost nearly 500,000 men trying to reduce the Rzhev salient. 500,000. The Germans lost tens of thousands. It was a stalemate written in blood. The Germans couldn't advance. The Soviets couldn't push them out. But something fundamental had changed. The Blitzkrieg was dead. The idea that Germany could win quick, cheap victories was gone. The Wehrmacht had lost over 1 million men in 6 months. That was 1/3 of its entire strength in the East. These weren't just numbers. These were the veterans, the men who had trained for years, the non-commissioned officers who formed the backbone of the army. They were dead or maimed or captured. They were replaced by raw recruits, teenagers from Hamburg and Bavaria who had barely held a rifle. They were thrown into the line at minus 30 degrees into units that were cynical, exhausted, and bitter. The quality of the German army began a decline that would never reverse. On the other side, the Soviet Union had survived. It had taken a blow that would have destroyed any other nation on Earth, and it was still standing. The factories in the Urals were coming online. They were churning out tanks, guns, and planes at a rate Germany could not match. The Lend-Lease aid from America and Britain was starting to arrive. Trucks, radios, spam. The balance of industrial power was tipping. But in the trenches outside Moscow, nobody was thinking about industrial output. They were thinking about the cold. By late February 1942, the temperature finally began to rise. The General Winter was leaving, but he left a landscape of horror. As the snow melted, the snowdrops appeared. This was the soldiers' grim slang for the bodies that had been buried by the snowfall during the winter battles. Thousands of them, emerging from the white blanket as the spring thaw set in. The thaw brought the Rasputitsa back. The mud returned. The fighting died down because movement became impossible again. The Battle of Moscow was effectively over. The Germans had been stopped, not at the border, not at the Dnieper, but at the bus stop. They had gotten within sight of the prize. And then the physics of the world, distance, weather, and the sheer mass of the Soviet resistance had crushed them. But the war was far from over. This brings us to the climax of our narrative. We have seen the advance, the stall, the crisis, and the stabilization. Now we need to understand the meaning of this event, the turning insight. The Battle of Moscow wasn't just a defeat for Germany. It was the moment they lost the war. They would fight for 3.5 more years. They would kill millions more people. But strategically, they died in December 1941. Why? Because the German war machine was built for a sprint. It had the lung capacity for a 100-meter dash. Moscow forced it to run a marathon. The Battle of Moscow is often overshadowed by Stalingrad. Stalingrad was the turning point where the Germans started losing. But Moscow was the turning point where they failed to win. The difference is subtle, but it is everything. In December 1941, the German High Command had to face a terrifying mathematical reality. The plan for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, had been based on destroying the Red Army west of the Dnieper River. They had done that. They had killed or captured millions, and yet there were new armies. General Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, wrote in his diary, "We have underestimated the Russian colossus. At the start of the war, we reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions. Now we have already counted 360. The Germans were fighting a hydra. For every head they cut off, 2 more grew back. And the German sword was getting dull." Let's look at the before and after of the Wehrmacht. Before Moscow.
The German army was an unstoppable precision instrument of maneuver warfare. Speed was its armor. Aggression was its fuel. After Moscow, the German army was a blunt instrument of defensive attrition. They had lost the initiative. They would never again launch a strategic offensive along the entire front. They could only punch in one place, like they tried at Stalingrad and Kursk, while holding on everywhere else. They had been forced into a war of production, a war of numbers. And in a war of numbers, Germany, a country the size of Texas with limited oil and manpower, could not beat the combined industrial might of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States. The failure at Moscow bought the Soviet Union the one thing it needed most: time. Time to move the factories, time to train the reserves, time for the T-34 to become the standard, time for Zhukov to learn how to beat the Germans at their own game. The 8 kilometers between Khimki and the Kremlin wasn't just a distance, it was a timeline. If the Germans had taken Moscow in October, the rail hub of the
Soviet Union would have been severed. The morale might have collapsed. The government might have fractured. The war could have ended in 1941, but they didn't. And because they didn't, the war dragged on to Berlin, July 17th, 1944, 3 years later. The Germans finally reached Moscow, but they didn't come as conquerors. 57,000 German prisoners of war were paraded through the streets of the capital. They were the remnants of Army Group Center, which had been finally annihilated in Operation Bagration. They marched in rows of 20. Generals at the front wearing their medals. Soldiers behind them, unshaven, dirty, defeated. The silence in the city was deafening. There were no cheers, no jeers, just hundreds of thousands of Muscovites watching in cold, hard silence. After the column passed, street cleaner trucks followed them, washing the asphalt with water, a symbolic cleansing of the fascist filth from the Russian earth. This was the resolution, the not X but Y. They did not enter Moscow with tanks in 1941. They entered it with bowed heads in 1944. The cultural memory of the Battle of Moscow in Russia is sacred. It is the first hero city. In the West, we often think of D-Day or El Alamein, but we must be honest with the numbers. 80% of all German military casualties in World War II occurred on the Eastern Front. For every American soldier killed fighting the Germans, 80 Soviet soldiers died. The Wehrmacht wasn't destroyed on the beaches of Normandy. It was bled white in the snowfields outside Moscow and then finished off in the steppes. The cost was apocalyptic. The Soviet Union lost nearly 1 million men in the defense of Moscow alone. That is more than the United States and Great Britain lost in the entire war combined. 1 million men in one battle. Today, if you drive from Sheremetyevo Airport into Moscow, you pass the town of Khimki. You will see a monument. 3 giant anti-tank obstacles, Czech hedgehogs, made of
stone and steel. They stand by the side of the highway. This marks the spot. This is where the motorcycle patrol stopped. This is where the 2nd Panzer Division ran out of fuel. This is where the empire of the Third Reich reached its maximum expansion. It is a quiet place now. Cars rush past it. Commuters going to work. Tourists going to the Kremlin. But if you stop and stand there in December, when the wind is blowing from the east and the temperature drops, you can almost feel it. The ghost of the vast machine grinding to a halt. The Germans got close enough to see the towers, close enough to dream of victory. But in war, close is a metric for losers. They were stopped not by a miracle, but by a friction they created themselves. They were stopped by the mud, by the ice, by the rails that were too wide, and by the men and women who refused to let them pass. They learned the hardest lesson of history. You can conquer a map, but you cannot conquer a geography, and you certainly cannot conquer a people who have nowhere left to retreat.